Queer activist and adjunct associate professor at the University of Cape Town, Melanie Judge, has compiled a thesis about homosexuality that resulted into a book that she titled Blackwashing, Homophobia, Violence and the Politics of Sexuality, Gender and Race. Now, in this offering, she aims to unpack queer culture in an effort to make the reader understand the true sense of homophobic violence, its origins in the South African context and the effects thereof, by putting specific emphasis on lesbian subjectivity. And for more on this, we're joined in studio by Professor Melanie Judge. Very good morning, Professor, and welcome.
Good morning, great to be here.
Indeed. Now, the book unpacks all forms of discrimination, homophobia, misogyny, patriarchy and power. Talk to us about why you found it important to lavish a particular focus on this subject matter.
Well, you know, Simpiwe, I've been working against violence and discrimination that faces lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people for many years now in South Africa. And I feel as an activist and as a scholar, it's really critical that we understand what the key drivers of these forms of violence are. Because, of course, our understandings of what motivates and what enables very pernicious forms of violence against sexual and gender minorities is going to shape the kinds of politics, the kinds of responses that are necessary. So I'm very committed to a project of unpacking the ways in which we make meaning of homophobia, particularly in the African context and in South Africa in particular.
So you reckon sexual violence is being precipitated by the lack of understanding of homosexuality?
Well, I think really what's very important to recognize is that there are a number of historical and social conditions that render lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people vulnerable to violence. And one of the ways that I'm trying to think about homophobic violence is to understand it as an instrument of power. It's a way of wielding power over people who don't conform to very strict gender and sexual codes. And so in that sense, violence is used to punish, to control, to tell people that they're not being the kinds of men and women that society demands of them.
Yeah, and your research focuses mainly on lesbians. Take us through the preparations as you were preparing to write this book.
Yes, indeed. So the focus was very much on lesbians' experiences of violence and how, in fact, lesbians themselves, diverse lesbians in terms of race, in terms of gender identity, in terms of class, how we ourselves as lesbians make sense of the violence that's wrought upon us. And so I ran a number of focus groups with lesbians across the country. I also looked at representations in the mainstream media around violence against lesbians, because of course you would know that the media is such a powerful mechanism to send messages to a broader society around issues of sexual diversity. And some of what I found in many of the media texts is the spectacularization of violence against lesbians that I think is very worrying, because what it does is it takes our attention away from the everyday conditions that produce an environment which makes violence against lesbians possible. So the everyday conditions of homophobic and transphobic jokes, the everyday conditions of very profound gender inequalities. And so when we get caught up in the spectacle of violence, we often don't pay attention to what it is in our everyday practice that makes that violence possible.
Do you think it'll ever end, though? I mean, there's different forms of sexual violence, one of which is what we call corrective rape.
It must end. And I think that's part of the...
Do you think it will, though, in our society?
Well, I think you've seen a radical change. I mean, certainly there's much more openness. So the fact that we're living in a democratic dispensation with very significant laws and policies that are there to advance and protect the rights of sexual and gender minorities is really critical. And the fact that many LGBT people are using those rights and those constitutional values to advance claims, to defend against very problematic forms of prejudice. So I think you've seen massive shifts in the post-apartheid period, but of course power, when it's challenged, always pushes back. And part of what we're seeing is that one of the ways in which that power pushes back, patriarchal power, homophobic power, is through forms of violence. So the contest is on. I think queers are up to the task. And really what for me is very important is that this is a broader social justice issue. That if we want to live in a society that's based on principles of equality and principles of justice, then violence against LGBT people should not only be the concern of queer people. It has to be the concern of everyone who is committed to struggles to end various forms of injustice in South Africa.
So in your observation, do you think authorities are doing enough to maybe counter this scourge? I mean, One interesting thing that comes to mind is the movie Inqeba. I know you wouldn't want to delve much into it, but in your view, do you think the situation was handled well by authorities?
I think one of the interesting things that we've seen, certainly in the last 15 years, is we've seen a heavy emphasis, significantly and importantly so, to change the laws of colonialism and apartheid that criminalize certain forms of gender and sexuality. And so there's been vast gains in terms of legal reform. But what we're seeing now, and Inqeba is an example of that, is that the battle, if you like, for equality for LGBT people is being played out not so much in the law and the courts anymore, or through the law and the courts, but in the cultural realm. In the realm of religion. And I think these are contestations, very important contestations about what it means to be a South African, what it means to be a black LGBT person, and that's part of what's at stake with these kinds of, if you like, battles around the identity of being African, of being South African, of being queer. So although it's obviously very fraught and people who have participated in this movie have been under massive pressure, I think that ultimately we have to take the struggle to the cultural and the religious realms, because those are the arenas in which society is so profoundly shaped.
All right, and where can you get hold of this book?
The book is available in bookstores and online.
All right. Professor, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's Professor Melanie Judge. She's a queer activist and adjunct professor, associate professor at the University of Cape Town, and she has been helping us unpack her latest book titled Blackwashing Homophobia, Violence and the Politics of Sexuality, Gender and Race. Pearl?
Well, we have been